dismantle decades-old agencies and initiatives which were initially designed to protect Black Americans and other marginalized communities. He has justified these actions by claiming he's rooting out racial discrimination disguised as diversity, equity, and inclusion. But as Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones points out in a new essay for the New York Times Magazine, in just months, Trump has managed to upend 6 decades of civil rights progress. And here's how. He's effectively dismantled the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. This is the very agency created to enforce the Civil Rights Act and to prevent discrimination in employment tied to federal dollars. He's also gutted the funding and staff needed to investigate and fight housing discrimination. He shuttered the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, which addressed the fact that Black communities are disproportionately exposed to toxic pollutants, pesticides, and waste. He's also closed the Department of Veteran Affairs Equity Office. Now, that office was dedicated to addressing the racial disparities in how disabled veterans receive compensation. He shut down regional civil rights offices that were key to fighting discrimination in schools and to enforcing desegregation. And he's even forced schools to eliminate initiatives that diversify teacher pipelines and support Black students to help close the achievement gap. And that's just some of what he's done as part of an sweeping effort to dismantle every program, every office, law, or mandate designed to protect the civil rights of Black Americans and other marginalized communities. These are protections that are still very much so desperately needed as the data continues to show that Black Americans suffer disproportionate discrimination across every sector of American life. Perhaps most disturbingly, he's now using the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department to enforce executive orders dismantling diversity programs. Nikole Hannah-Jones put it plainly, quote, by deploying the Civil Rights Act against the very people it was created to protect, conservatives hope to get as close to their ultimate goal as possible, repealing it. Joining me now is Nikole Hannah-Jones. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, the New York Times Magazine creator of the 1619 Project, and the founder of the Center for Journalism and Democracy at the Howard University, which is probably the most important thing on her resume. Nikole, good morning. Thank you so much for being here. Always a pleasure to talk to you. I read the piece, phenomenal historical account of the progression of both civil rights in America and their dismantling. One of the central themes that I think is really important that you talk about, I'd love to expand on, is the notion that regardless of what's codified, if you don't have these agencies and institutions that are intended to enforce the laws that are on the books, it leaves our rights as Black people subject to erasure.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on to discuss this piece. And that is really a key theme of the essay. We understand that laws need enforcement when it comes to almost everything except civil rights. We understand that just because you outlaw murder doesn't mean you don't need a police department. It doesn't mean that you don't need an entire system of justice to enforce the laws and make sure that people follow them. Yet when it comes to civil rights, we kind of believe that they're self-enforcing, that just the very existence of those laws are enough to make people end discrimination and for us all to have equality. Of course, that's never been true. So what Trump is doing in his administration is basically, he doesn't have the ability to overturn the 1964 Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act or the Fair Housing Act, but he can gut the entire enforcement mechanism and send the message that if you discriminate, there's no one in federal government that is actually going to enforce the law. So what I tried to show in this piece is we have been here before in America. You know, the entire civil rights movement was fought to really vindicate rights that Black people had already won following the end of slavery. The Civil Rights Acts that were passed in the 1860s, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. These were laws that had already been passed, and yet they existed on paper. And when you had a federal government and state governments that wouldn't enforce them, it's as if those laws did not exist. And Black people were certainly not protected by them. And so this is the fear, is that we're entering another era like that.
You know, Nikole, in your connection to history, the way that you just did, another theme that I noticed when I read the piece was this conversation about how disinformation and distortion of a narrative actually shapes opinions around the necessity for civil rights and how at the turn of Reconstruction, there was an effort by school teachers and textbooks to essentially whitewash history in such a way that made people think differently about the first black Republicans that were elected to the Senate following Reconstruction, following slavery, and how that shaped things, and how now there's also a similar disinformation campaign that has made it seemingly more okay for folks to be not as outraged that civil rights are being erased just 5 years after America's racial reckoning in 2020. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So we know that these efforts to rewrite history, these disinformation campaigns, they go hand in hand. They erase the history first, and that allows them then to erase your rights. And so I talk about this organization called the United Daughters of the Confederacy that rises up after the end of the Civil War. I liken them to, the post-Reconstruction era version of the Moms for Liberty that we see today, which is this group of white women who decide that they want to rewrite the narrative around the white South and why we ever had a civil war in the first place. And so they begin to take control and try to urge the changing of curriculum. They're writing textbooks, and they are basically legitimizing Jim Crow because they are writing a story, a narrative of the South that Black people were incapable of self-governance, that Black people were getting jobs and getting positions that they didn't deserve, that may sound familiar to the times that we're in, and that Black people were not the rightful participants in democracy. So you have these narratives that are being put out in textbooks, that are being placed, all of the Confederate monuments that we saw, those don't begin until after the fall of Reconstruction. They don't happen right after slavery. And that's creating a narrative that allows the stripping of Black people's rights. So I think we're seeing a similar effort here. These efforts to really downplay the history of racism, to downplay Black accomplishments. The federal government and the Donald Trump administration, we've paid a lot of attention to the way that they have been working to erase the accomplishments of Black people. We haven't paid as much attention to the way that they're actually eradicating the enforcement mechanisms for our civil rights. I think that is just as critical. And the last point I want to quickly make, we keep labeling this DEI. That's because the Trump administration is saying that what he's doing is challenging DEI. Well, first of all, no court has ever said DEI is illegal or discriminatory, but also they're not actually tackling DEI alone. They're actually dismantling the ability to integrate our organizations to try to bring about equality and the enforcement of civil rights.
Always something that I think about, which is paying as much attention to the equality of outcomes as we have tried to the equality of opportunity. So much I could talk to you about this, but thank you for your time this morning, Nikole. That is esteemed journalist and Howard University professor, Nikole Hannah-Jones.